Okay, good evening to everyone. Hope you are well. Thank you for joining us for a little discussion, a little bit of Torah learning, which is always a good thing to do. And our discussion tonight will be about Kiddush. Now, when you say Kiddush, people get excited. It's a time that we get together. If you remember in the olden days, a year and a half ago in shuls, you would get together, drink something, eat something, bond with your community. A wonderful time without a doubt. Due to the fact that this is going to be a halachic discussion. So we'll discuss a few things that relate to the halachos of Kiddush. And it's a significant and broad area of halacha. So obviously we're not going to cover it all. And I'm considering, God willing, to have another discussion next week about Kiddush. So I'll be more than happy to take any questions in the chat here, or you can email. And very soon I'm going to post here a few sources for our discussion that we could be actually looking at text. That's what we hope to do over the next 55 minutes here as we discuss Kiddush. Now, I'm going to start off by mentioning three things: bread, wine, and chamar medina. Chamar medina. Bread, wine, chamar medina. Now, the three of them, what they have in common is that they are all three, in some circumstances, good for our Kiddush and for our Havdalah. Now, there are going to be limitations. Some cases, yes. Some cases, no. So that's what I'm going to discuss a little bit. Bread, wine, and chamar medina. And the third one obviously needs to have a little bit of an explanation what I am referring to. So number one, ideally, a person should be making his Kiddush on wine, Havdalah on wine. And even the daytime Kiddush, the Kiddush we make Shabbat morning, which is clearly rabbinic, it appears that it was considered, at least for many authorities, it was considered an ideal to use wine. Okay, so wine clearly has a very close relationship with Kiddush. Fine. Number two is bread. And if you do look at some old Sidurim, when they print the Friday night Kiddush, within the Kiddush itself, when you reach the point of making the bracha over the food or beverage that's in front of you, many of the old Sidurim actually state that if you are making your Kiddush on bread, you say here, Hamotzi lecha min haaretz. If you are making your Kiddush on wine, you say your Borei Pri Hagafen. So there was a time, and it appears that even in European communities, they did not have access to wine. It was expensive and people were poor. And I have no doubt that even when it comes to 100 years ago, such situations did exist. Kiddush was made over, Friday night Kiddush, I should make it clear, was made over the bread. And that's fine, no question about it. Now, Shabbos morning, one cannot make his Kiddush over bread. That doesn't work. And here we're going to introduce the concept called chamar medina. The Talmud shares with us a story of one of the authorities coming to a town, and it came time for Havdalah, and the beverage that was used was beer. This is Babylonian beer, which was not made from grains, but it was a date beer. Not a beer you drink on a date, a beer that was made with dates. And the authority was quite surprised that people are making Havdalah with beer. Should you not be using wine? But then afterwards, he realized that this beer is chamar medina, which you could translate it as chamar is wine, medina means of the country, of the region. For this country, for this region, this is considered wine. Now, what does that mean exactly? So it appears when I want to drink a beverage, there are beverages I drink just to address my thirst, like water. There are times that there are beverages that are an opportunity for a social gathering. People would get together for a wine tasting, for example. So the beverage is considered significant if people get together and people set time aside to go ahead and meet friends over a few glasses of wine. So that indicates that wine is something significant. You would not have people getting together to go ahead and share different samples of waters. You never know in today's funny world where they have vitamin waters that they sell for $3 for a small bottle. Well, perhaps people look at things a little bit differently. But historically, when it comes to a beverage that people would use as an opportunity for a social gathering, wine would be one. There's no doubt. So we are being told that in Babylonia, there was another such beverage that a person would consume, even if they're not thirsty, perhaps, but for the social enjoyment or for the enjoyment that this actual beverage provides. That such a beverage, and obviously beer fits into that category. And there is no question that over the past 500-600 years, whiskey fits into that category. Whiskey and beer turned into chamar medina. That is like the wine. Wine is used and consumed not just when you are thirsty, but for an enjoyment. So too when it comes to beer and whiskey. And therefore, halachically, havdalah could be made on beer. It could be made on whiskey. My grandmother, Allah Shalom, used to love sharing the story that in Montevideo, Uruguay, there was an old shamish who, after Yom Kippur, would make havdalah over alcohol, but this was, at least the way I remember it, 96% alcohol. Like that, I don't know if they were common today or where you could find it. And my savta would say that this fellow would drink his glass, put it down, and it given vigornish, like he just drank Wasser, like he drank water. So havdalah, you could clearly use chamar medina. Whiskey is fine, beer is fine. Now, Shabbat morning, we all know you could use chamar medina. Friday night, we follow the opinion of most of the Rishonim, of the early authorities, that for Friday night, we do not use chamar medina. And in a situation that you don't have wine, you use your challah. Okay? So that's just something a little bit of a basic. But the first thing I would like to share with you here as a source that we're turning to is a statement from the Chinuch, Sefer HaChinuch. And I like this statement because it addresses the following question. Havdalah is not made over challah. You cannot make your havdalah over bread. Friday night Kiddush can and was made over bread. What's the difference between the two? So comes this authority, comes the Sefer HaChinuch, and he tells us the following. Rov ha'olam, the majority of people, yitavu, they have a desire, el hashtiya b'motzei Shabbat, most people will have a desire for a good beverage motzei Shabbat, yoter mina achila, more than eating. It appears that in general, on motzei Shabbat, people had less of an appetite for food and more of a desire for a good beverage. Why is it? Because lefi shekvar kav'u seuda gdola, they already had a very significant and large meal bayom, during the day, lichvot Shabbat, in honor of the Shabbat. In other words, when we make blessings over things, it needs to be something we enjoy. You know, Judaism is a religion that is in tune with us as humans. And Judaism recognizes the fact that we have desires. And the Torah tells us what you are supposed to do with desires is channel them in the right direction. Don't fight nature, channel it. So if, let's say, I enjoy a good beverage, so what am I told to do? Make Kiddush with it. Express your gratitude to the Almighty by drinking a good glass of wine Friday night. That's Judaism. But due to the fact that the Torah recognizes your desires, the Torah wants you to go ahead and make those blessings when you have those desires. Friday night, I could make my Kiddush on a challah because I'm hungry Friday night. I think we're all hungry Friday night. Shabbos after Friday afternoon, you're busy, no time for a meal. Halachically, you shouldn't sit down for a meal a few hours before Shabbat. So I sit down Friday night, I'm hungry. And if I look at the challah, it is something I'm looking forward to. I have a desire. If I have a desire to eat that challah, it's an opportunity to make a blessing and express my gratitude to the Creator and use it as a tool to sanctify the day. Motzei Shabbat, on the other hand, I'm full. I had a Seudah Gdola Bayom Lichvod HaShabbat, and therefore it appears that you will be enjoying far more a good beverage, a good glass of wine, a beer, or some whiskey. That is what we are being told by this text. So it's a real fundamental statement about how we view Judaism, but it also explains to me, if you go through the books, if you go through the sources, it appears that this concept of Chamar Medina, the concept of using a beverage that is like wine, is not an ideal. That's how it appears if you look at the text. On the other hand, I think you do know that for many of us, it is the norm. Shabbat morning, you make Kiddush over whiskey or beer. Motzei Shabbat, people do it. And I think the explanation is that Judaism wants you to be in tune with what you desire. And if I have more of an enjoyment Shabbos morning making Kiddush on some whiskey or beer, the Torah wants me. That is what I should use as a vehicle, as a tool to express my gratitude and to feel that connection to the higher being. So it really tells us what our religion is about. And I think that this is a nice way of starting our discussion, because the essence of Kiddush is to tell us, the Jewish people, God provided for us a magnificent world. See me in the world. See the Creator in the world. And that's how you develop Ahavat Hashem, a love of God. I think that if when I sometimes want to get inspired, you could get on YouTube the Planet Earth videos. It was on Netflix. They posted it on YouTube, and they have these series of incredible footage from the Amazons, from jungles, from forests, from the ocean. It's an incredible work for them to have the ability of filming from Siberian tigers to these incredible looking creatures and birds in the Amazons. And what you see there is the complexity, the beauty, the magnificence of this world. And for a fool to claim that this is just something that came about on its own, it's simply shocking that a human could say that. Because for me, it is an opportunity to look and say, Marabu Masecha Hashem. And as the Rambam tells us, that's how you develop Ahavat Hashem. You love the Creator when you are in awe of the magnificence of the world. So it is really the Jewish journey is feeling connected to the world, enjoying Shabbat, enjoying that glass of wine. And when you use it right, that is a tool of goodness. I like sharing the Vart that when the spies in this week's portion, when the spies, the Meraglim, left to the land of Israel, the Torah tells us, Vehayamim, the days when they departed, were Yemei Bikurei Anavim. There were the days when the first grapes ripen. So we know, this is the Talmud tells us, that we actually have the precise date of the departure of the spies. The spies left on the 29th of Sivan. So if you do the calculations, if the 29th of Sivan is the day when the first grapes ripen, so the 29th of the Sivan was actually most probably a day when there was a lot of crushing taking place. What do I mean by that? That in the land of Israel, people would crush grapes or start crushing grapes on the 29th of Sivan, set those barrels aside for 40 days, and 40 days later, open up the first barrel of wine. Now, there's no question that the first time you open that seasonal barrel of wine is an exciting moment. Wine is ready for the season. And it's a day that you could do some incredible things with. You could lift that wine, smell it, drink it, express your gratitude to the Creator, recognize that you have a relationship with Him, recognize that that comes with responsibilities. The day of the wine being ready is an incredible day. But like all physical pleasures, if that takes charge of you, if wine really controls me and I misuse it, it could be a very destructive day. So that day when wine was ready was a day of tremendous potential for good, but it could actually be a very destructive day. If the crushing of the grapes was on the 29th of Sivan, and as we know, it takes 40 days to have your wine ready, right? From the moment of crushing to the moment that you have a glass of wine that is considered wine, it takes 40 days. The result is that wine was ready. That significant day of wine was actually on the 9th day of the month of Av, Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av was that day that when you use the word correctly, it is a celebration. When you misuse it, it is destructive. And therefore, in our tradition, Tisha B'Av will one day again turn into a day of celebration because we're going to use the world appropriately. Recognize the Creator, appreciate Him, feel that we have a relationship, remember our responsibilities. Pleasure is not an enemy. Channel those pleasures and live a Jewish life. That's what this is all really an introduction to our discussion about Kiddush tonight. Now, my first journey starts off with a Friday night in Cleveland, Ohio. The Friday night in Cleveland, Ohio. And as I've mentioned to you in the past, my maternal grandparents lived in a suburb of Cleveland, a place called Wickliffe. And just give me just 1 second. And my grandfather, Rabbi Manis, was a Yeke, a real Yeke, and he stuck to German traditions. So as a child, it was always perplexing that here you have observant parents, and I'm talking about a 6-year-old, and you also have observant grandparents, but they do things differently. And it was something, and as a sensitive kid, it was something that was a little bit complex for me. And I remember the differences from a very, very young age. I remember the differences. In other words, I knew that in my own house, we would open the refrigerator on Shabbat at any time as long as the light bulb was out. By my grandparents, they had a concern. They followed those who have a concern that if you open the refrigerator door when the motor is not running, perhaps some warmer air will seep into the refrigerator and kick off the thermostat. So therefore, they would only open the refrigerator to remove or return items when the motor was running. So as a child, it was something fascinating to watch grandparents standing by the refrigerator waiting for the motor to go on. I don't know, it was something that had an impact. One of those other things that had an influence on me, that my grandparents, the Yeke grandfather, the German grandfather, has a tradition that is different than my father. And that related to Friday night Kiddush. Because Friday night Kiddush, the way it worked was that before Kiddush, everyone would wash their hands for hamotzi, and you would be silent. You sit down by the table, you go ahead and you make Kiddush, and then straight move into hamotzi. In other words, the order which I was accustomed to from home, you make Kiddush, and then you get up and you wash your hands and you come back. By the Zaidi, by the Yekesha grandfather, it was different. Fine. So obviously, as a child, you know that it's done like that. It's interesting. It's odd. It's different than what I was used to. But as I got older, I developed more of an appreciation when I went through the sources. And it's a very fascinating section of Talmud and section that the authorities address. And it has to do with the proper reading of a section of the Talmud. So we're going to start with a few words by Reb Moshe Isserlis the Ramah. Okay, so that's what we're going to start with. Rabbi Moshe Isserlis the Ramah. What you have to remember here is that we're studying now words of a 16th century scholar who lived in Poland, but due to the fact that the Polish communities were relatively new when it comes to halachic matters, in other words, the teacher of Reb Moshe Isserlis originated from the German yeshivot or the yeshivot in Czechoslovakia, meaning the Polish community was newish at that time. So the customs that sometimes we hear from the Ramah are actually German customs. So here we go. The Ramot tells us that you should know. Yesh omrim. There are those who say that lechatchila, ideally. You know what is ideal? Yesh litol yadav kodem kiddush. There are those who say that the ideal practice is to wash your hands, netilas yodaim, before kiddush, and only afterwards ulekadesh al hayayin, and only after that do you make your kiddush, and then you move straight into hamotzi. And he tells us, Vechen haminag pashut b'medinot elu. This is the custom in these communities. Now, what you have to realize is that when you read the sources don't seem to indicate that this is the ideal. If I go through Talmudic literature and the early authorities, the Rishonim, it doesn't seem like an ideal, but it was the minhag. And the Ramah was a believer that if there's a minhag, you respect the minhag. It is something that is very common throughout all his writings. Respect minhagim. And therefore he ends off that you should know, since it is the custom to go ahead and litol yadav kodem kiddush, that people wash before kiddush, he writes, ve'ein leshanot. Ashkenazim, ein leshanot, don't change it. That was what we were told by Reb Moshe Isserlis. And therefore, odds are, even though many scholars felt, this doesn't flow well with the text and the reading of the Talmud, ein leshanot. Now, some were uncomfortable with it. So it's interesting to trace the shift in practice. So I'm going to move forward to an authority that lived some 75 years later, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, known as the author of the Beit Chadash. And he tells us that you should know, in some ways, perhaps, drinking Kiddush between the washing and the motzi, maybe it's a hefsek, maybe it separates the two. So therefore, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis makes a recommendation. And he says, lechatchila, ideally, yikadesh habalabait ve'achar kach yitol yadav. For the one making Kiddush, for him, it would be more appropriate to first make Kiddush, then go wash his hands. Meaning, although the Ramah said that everyone washes first, he says that's not ideal. But even Rabbi Yoel Sirkis agrees, aval bnei beito, when it comes to family members, when it comes to all those who are not making the Kiddush, regarding them, he says, Lo yishanu klal. They shouldn't change the minhag. They should continue with the old minhag of washing hands beforehand. Ela yitlu yedehem kodem akiddush. They should wash their hands before Kiddush. Okay? That's what he tells us. And if you move a little bit forward, the son-in-law of Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, Rabbi David Halevi, he says straight out that even though afal pi shekatav, so it's like eating away into the Ramah, the Rabbi Yoel Sirkis changes it for the one making Kiddush. Rabbi David Halevi is the first one that says, you know what? Since as you study the sources, you see that ideally Kiddush is to be before the washing. So he says the following: Afal pei, even though shekatav, even though the Ramah says ve'ein leshanot, don't change the minhag. Mikol makom, nevertheless, mishechared ladavar, someone that fears, he wants to perform the mitzvah in its most ideal way, ve'rotze la'asot kede'a rishona, and wants to follow the practice of Rabbi Yosef Karo, which is first Kiddush, velitol yadav achara Kiddush, and to wash after Kiddush. Don't say to such a person you shouldn't be changing, but rather yachol lomar eseket varay. In other words, he is the first one that gives not just the green light, but perhaps even encouragement to change the minhag. Rabbi David Halevi was more text-based authority, that if you have an indication from sources to do things one way, you do it even if the minhag seems to be otherwise, and that's his recommendation. And if I skip 100 years forward, the Vilna Gaon, so this is in Lithuania, the Gaon of Vilna says, Nahagu achshav hakol, all Jews, and these are the Jews that the Vilna Gaon was familiar with in Lithuania, litol yadayim kodem hakiddush, and that became the norm. And that explains why in my father's home and my father's father's home, and I'm sure it goes back to his grandparents as well, you first what is it? It's interesting. I read it wrong, it seems like. Litol yadayim. Maybe I didn't copy this right, because the Vilna Gaon was not an authority I should be quoting here. We'll put that aside, especially I see Ken here. So I'm a little bit worried about being a descendant of the Vilna Gaon. So I should move forward to the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim tells us, you should know, that the proper practice is lekadesh al hayayin kodem netilat yadayim. So the Chafetz Chaim says that you go ahead and do Kiddush beforehand. So let's get to a story, a little bit of a story. And this I found in an article that addresses this issue, and it relates to my yeshiva. I learned in Chicago, I learned in a Telz yeshiva, and among the surprises I had, even though Telz yeshiva was a Lithuanian yeshiva, it followed the practice of everyone washing before Kiddush. The only person who didn't was actually the one making Kiddush. So the story shared here is the following, that one Friday night, the Rosh Hashiva Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch, who we discussed last week, Rabbi Eliyahu Meir Bloch was in the yeshiva, and he followed the old Telz custom of telling everyone to wash before Kiddush, but he noticed that there were a few Bochrim that were not comfortable with it. So he declared, Etzleinu betelz, the minhag of Telz in Lita was, Nahagol litol yadayim lifnei Kiddush, that was the custom in Telz. And you should know, Yeshivat Telz hukma od lifnei shenitchaber HaMishnah Berurah. In other words, even though the Chafetz Chaim makes a recommendation to go ahead and first make Kiddush, we follow that tradition. Anyway, all I want to share with you is that you follow your traditions. and a little bit of an explanation of the different things that I learned regarding this matter. What I want to move on to is my interesting journey with a text called Sefer HaChilukim, an interesting journey that I had. And it works as follows. There was a great 16th century authority called Rabbi Shlomo Luria. Rabbi Shlomo Luria. Rabbi Shlomo Luria was the author of a work on Talmud called Yam Shel Shlomo. I have here in my hand the Yam Shel Shlomo. It's a beautiful one. I like it very much. It was printed in the year 1861, and this one belonged to my great-grandfather, and it's old, but it's still in good shape, and I love using it. Now, on one of its last pages, it has there a list of what's known as chilukim. Now, what exactly is the term a chiluk? Well, a chiluk means differences. So it appears that they printed at the end of one section of this Yam Shel Shlomo the many differences between the communities in Babylonia and the communities in Eretz Yisrael. As you know, from the 3rd century on, the hub of Torah moved to Babylonia. Nevertheless, there was a strong Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael. As a result of the fact that these were different communities with different traditions, so there were many chilukim. There were many, differences in practice. At some point, someone recorded those chilukim, and it was in a form of a manuscript. Someone wrote down all the differences. Fine, it's a small manuscript, it's not very long. Now, it was never really printed as a separate work. It was just a small, several pages. The first one to actually print it, if I'm not mistaken, was Rabbi Shlomo Luria. Rabbi Shlomo Luria went ahead and he published the Chilukim. Now, as a result of the fact that it wasn't attributed to anyone specific, there were those who believed, in other words, I have it here. If you look, if it's hard to see it, he writes here, Kol Chilukei Dinim. So this is published in Rabbi Shlomo Luria's work. Kol Chilukei Dinim bein Bnei Eretz Yisrael uben Bnei Bavel. And it provides a list of 50 differences. And it's basically in a half a page. Fine. Now, people were impressed with this. Here you have a list of differences. And some people even attributed it to Rabbi Shlomo Luria. What they didn't know is that this is a very old manuscript that probably dates back to the 8th century. You hear this? Very old manuscript. And it shares with us traditions. Some of them originate in Babylonia, and some of them originate in Eretz Yisrael, as mentioned. But what a very special scholar was able to do, he was able to track Ashkenazi practices to those that were done in Eretz Yisrael, and Sephardi practices to ones that were done in Bavel. Why? Well, perhaps due to commerce. So that's what we're going to go ahead and discuss in the second part of this class. A difference in practice that you will see by some, not by others, and it could be traced back to this work called Sefer HaChilukim of the 8th century. And it works as follows. Have you ever seen, or perhaps, do you have a practice of adding some water to your wine for your Kiddush? That you add a little bit of water. Have you ever seen, or do you have such a practice? Okay, now, some people do it. Some people do it. Other people don't. Where does it come from? Where does it come from? So if you read Talmudic literature, you'll note that the Talmud often, when it talks about pouring wine, it uses the term limzog, even in modern Hebrew. Limzog, to pour wine is limzog. The word limzog, mezek, is really has to do with balance. Balance. Now, what does pouring wine have to do with balance? Maybe after a few glasses, you lose your balance, perhaps. I don't know. So what does pouring wine have to do with balance? What a good way to spoil good wine. Okay, yeah. Okay, perhaps. So why? But my question, it's a real question. Why is pouring wine called in the Talmud limzog? The answer is, if we would visit Babylonian communities, the norm was to add water to wine, something that would be unacceptable to many of us. It was the norm. To such an extent that in Talmudic sources, it seems to be that the rabbis recommended not to drink wine straight, but always to add water. And when you read about the percentages, they could be shocking. We are told in the Talmud that Rava would make his mezigah, his balance, where it was 25% wine, 75% water. And I think to myself, what are they doing with good wine? Surprising. Now, although the Talmudic sources indicate that that's what you should be doing, and as traditional Jews in general, we try to follow those Talmudic sources, comes Rashbam, so this is a grandson of Rashi, writing in the early 12th century, that you should know, after reading the Talmud, don't think that you should be diluting your French wines, because Yenot shelanu lo by meziga. Our wines do not need to be diluted. In France, we do not dilute our wines. That's what we are being told. So it appears that some communities continued with this tradition of adding water to the wine. Other communities followed the practice that nowadays our wines don't need it. And what's interesting is that if I move on to Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch tells us, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Sephardi, says, Yain Chai, meaning wine that had no water added to it, Mikatshin alav, it's okay for Kiddush, but not ideal. Umikol makom, however, Yoter tov lemozgo, he makes a recommendation that it would be better to add water to your wine, even a little bit. Ramah, on the other hand, says, Yeinot shelanu, our wines are yoter tovim hem belo meziga. Ramah says that our wines, European wines, it is better to drink them without diluting them. No water should be added. So we have here different traditions. By the way, the Kabbalists have an insight into adding water into wine, because water is viewed as an attribute of mercy. Wine, for whatever reason, relates to the attribute of justice. So you add and you try to somehow fix or add mercy to the justice. That's how the Kabbalists explain it, not our field, obviously. Fine. So we have here Ashkenazi practice, Sephardi practice. Okay? Now, what I'm trying to show is the fact that this Sefer Achilukim, that this text that indicates that there were different, if you look at the communities of Eretz Yisrael and Babylonia of the 8th century, for example, you'll notice those differences indeed. So here we go. Now comes the story. The picture here is of a person I've never met. He passed away, I think, in 1967. His name is Professor Mordechai Margaliot. Now, he's not well known, But among scholars of Jewish studies, he's a very significant name, a very, very significant name. He published a lot, he wrote a lot, he wrote an encyclopedia about Talmudic authorities, he worked on things in the Geniza, a major scholar indeed. Now, Mordechai Margaliot happened to be my great aunt's husband. In other words, my grandmother Malevsky had a sister Rachel. Rachel was a great scholar as well. Rachel was a great scholar. She wrote on Iyov. She wrote on Yeshayahu. And her husband was a scholar as well. And I've been told, and again, I've never met him, he passed away before I was born, that sometimes you would walk into their house and they would comment on one another. How she would say, you think you're a great scholar? And she would respond to him, do you think you're a great scholar? So it was an interesting amount of, an interesting environment in a very brilliant home of two top scholars. They lived in Yerushalayim on Balfour Street. Balfour Street, and some of you are perhaps familiar with the geography of Yerushalayim. The prime minister's home is in Balfour. I don't know who's going to be there in a week or two, right? But they lived next to the prime minister for many years. Now, my father would share with me that when he would visit Uncle Mordechai Margaliot was very welcoming and friendly. And he told my father, you know what the difference is between me and you? So again, this is an old scholar talking to a 22-year-old yeshiva boy who's studying in yeshiva, in the Mir Yeshiva. So Mordechai would say to my father, you are interested in understanding what Abaye and Rava said. You are interested in understanding what the scholars of the Talmud have to say. I am more interested in what they were wearing at the time. Okay, that's what Uncle Mordechai would say. As a scholar, he's interested in things that have to do more that are external. Now, by the way, sometimes when these scholars provide for us information of external things, of what kind of dishes they used or what kind of ovens they used, or perhaps what was their norm when it comes to drinking wine, it could actually assist us in our learning. That was Uncle Mordechai. Uncle Mordechai Margaliot, actually, this I heard from my great aunt, that he had a practice that he would buy old books, and they were quite available in Israel, old books from 17th century. And what he would do is he would often, let me just fix that again. What he would do often is he would remove the hard covers from the book, the covers, soak them in some kind of solution that would separate the papers that created the hard cover, hang them to dry, and he discovered many, many manuscripts because he figured out that the way they used to make the covers was by compressing old books, old papers. So that's how he would discover manuscripts sometimes from these covers. And you would walk into his home, and the whole house basically had strings, papers, and laundry clips, right? Those the people would use for hanging laundry throughout the house. A very fascinating place to visit. I visited after his passing and was always interested in the history of Uncle Mordechai. So Uncle Mordechai Margaliot is the person that gets the credit for publishing the manuscript of Sefer HaChilukim. In other words, he went ahead, he found old manuscripts, he deciphered it, he gave commentary. And this book that gives us from the 8th century, the differences between the way things were done in Eretz Israel vis-a-vis Babylonia, was the work that he put together. So what we're going to do now is we're going to quote, we're going to read from the Sefer HaChilukim, and it's called Sefer HaChilukim ben Bnei Mizrach. It is a book that records the differences between those who live in the East, which is obviously Babylonia, Uma'arav, and those who live in the west. And it notes the following. You should know, Anshe Mizrach, the people who live in the east, in Babylonia, in the 8th century, Ein Mivarchim al Hayain, they will not make a blessing on wine, Ela Mazug, unless it is diluted. Now, when I was in yeshiva, they would claim that in the olden days, the wines were stronger, which I'm not sure what exactly that means. I don't think it means there was more alcohol in it. It's possible that palates get used to different things. In other words, take someone who's been drinking light Italian wines that have 6% alcohol, right? You know, these Bartanuras, 6% alcohol, and suddenly give them a nice deep Cabernet or Merlot that has 14% alcohol. So for a person whose palate got accustomed to such wines of 6%, to shoot it up suddenly to 14% is a significant change. So it's possible that these Anshe Mizrach, that the Jewish communities of Babylonia simply got accustomed to watering down their wine, and that's how they drank it. Another possibility is that wine did not, or grapes and wine production was not taking place in Babylonia. You don't see Iraqi wines. They were imported. When you import wine in the olden days, wine would often spoil, so they would add ingredients to it, sugar, spices. So perhaps the wine in Babylonia was a wine that had already some sweetener, so had some spices, you add some water, it was more like a punch. That's perhaps how they drank wine in Babylonia. On the other hand, this text continues. B'nai Eretz Yisrael, those who were in the land of Israel, Mivarchim alav, they make a blessing on wine, Keshehu chai, when it is not diluted. They call it chai, meaning as if raw. That was the norm in Eretz Yisrael. What Mordechai Margiliot points out is what's quite fascinating is that the Babylonian practice became the Sephardi practice. And that's why Bet Yosef tells us, Rabbi Yosef Karo, that the Sephardi practice was to add a little bit of or some water to your wine. The European custom is like the Bnei Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, there's some logic to it, because the earliest Ashkenazi communities originated in Italy. The Clonnumus family in a city called Lucca. I think the Wolves visited Lucca. And Italian Jewry actually came from Eretz Yisrael. We have records of those who have arrived in southern Italy from Eretz Yisrael. So it's not far-fetched to believe that minhagei, the customs of Eretz Yisrael, made their way to Italy, Germany, and then throughout Europe. On the other hand, the Babylonian scholars were in touch with the Jewish community in Spain, right? We have what's known as the Tshuvot HaGeonim. We have response of the 9th and the 10th century of Jews who lived in Spain, and they communicated with the yeshivot in Babylonia. They would send to Babylonia questions with support, with money, because that was really, Babylonia was the hub of Jewish studies, and they were supported by Jews in Spain. And the Jews in Babylonia, the institutions and the yeshivot, would send shuvot, responsa, Torah information, Torah knowledge to Spain, indicating that there was a link between Spain and Babel. And therefore, Mordechai Margaliot claims that it is not far-fetched at all to believe that the Babylonian practice of diluting your wine and seeing it as an ideal became something that Sfaradim do and a practice that they follow. Okay, so these are obviously more intellectual and academic discussions. But I think we should end off a little bit with something that is a little bit halachic. Wow. So, it's interesting. David mentions here that they actually made a Havdalah in Luca. Luca is really viewed. It's an incredible place to be, from what I understand. I haven't been there, because you could actually meditate that you talk about Ashkenazi Jewry, and it originates in this place called Luca. So it's very fascinating to make Havdalah there in the walled city of Luca. That's very interesting. Okay. Something halachic, which is, perhaps a practical, and that's what we're going to end off with, something halachic. We do not eat or drink before Kiddush. Right? You're not supposed to eat or drink before Kiddush. And the question, could be that I'm actually getting the question that I want to address. Some have a minhag to eat before Shacharis, before Kiddush. Where is the source for this? Ooh, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. That's a good question. Number two, since we use Chamar Medina, good Scotch, hopefully, Shabbos day, there is a clear dispute as to what the shear should be, shot glass or regular glass. Okay, very good. So these are two solid questions, which I would very, very happy to address. So here we go. Question number one. We are not to be eating before Kiddush. So therefore, after davening, if I want to eat, I need to make Kiddush. The question is, what about before davening? Now, if a person opens a Shulchan Aruch, you'll read that technically speaking, a person should not be eating before Kiddush. And a few weeks ago, Pesach time, when my son Moshe was here, he spoke, and he talked about the issue of eating before Kiddush. So many people have a tradition, which I do as well, that if a person will not be able to daven like a mensch, and your head and your thoughts are only about when am I going to finally get my tam-tam and herring, and it's going to impact your Kiddush, it is better to eat something before Kiddush than to daven in a way that's not a davening. Okay? That's the tradition that I have. Some people have. Obviously, you don't sit down for a whole meal, at least from the sources I follow. You don't sit down for a meal. You eat a little bit that you could pull through davening. That's what is done by many. Some question it, but many of us have such a tradition. Now comes the question, wait a second, if you have such a minhag to eat before Shachris, which it appears I'm not the only one, what about Kiddush? The answer is, Kiddush is an obligation only at the time, only if it's Shat Seudah. Okay? In other words, when you have a chovat, it is time for a meal, then you have an obligation to go ahead and make Kiddush. Before davening, there is no such obligation. You hear what I'm saying? When I eat sometime Shabbos morning before davening, and it's a small amount, there is no obligation for me to make Kiddush. Even though the Chafetz Chaim actually wrote that a person who is a choleh and needs to eat before davening should make Kiddush, the vast majority of authorities don't follow that practice, and therefore we don't have a chovat kiddush. Bottom line, you eat before davening something for the sake of your davening with kavana, no need for Kiddush. Now comes the question, what about if it's a woman at home, doesn't come to shul, for example, and she has, so it would depend. If a woman has the practice of Shabbos morning davening the full davening, right? So once she davened the full davening, she should wait for Kiddush. If it's a person that doesn't really daven always due to the fact that they are busy, and they daven a small amount of davening, some believe that small amount, after that they are obligated. Others say, like Ramosha Feinstein, that technically there's no obligation until the husband comes home for the time of davening. So bottom line is that if you daven, you should make Kiddush before you eat. If you didn't daven yet, even if you said brachos, you could go ahead and eat something if the goal of the eating is to be able to daven. So hopefully I addressed question number 2. Question number 1. Question number 2 has to do with measurement. So as we know, a kos for Kiddush has to hold what's known as a revi'it. A revi'it means a quarter of a measurement called a lug, and the rabbis provide for us the formula. It's the volume of an egg and a half. The volume of an egg and a half is probably about 2.8 ounces, and we try to use a Kiddush cup of 3 ounces. A Kiddush cup should have 3 ounces. Some are more machmir, but technically speaking, that's enough. Now, that works very well if you're making Kiddush on wine, or if you are making Kiddush on beer. You want even more than 3 ounces, in my opinion, right? But what happens if you are making it on whiskey? On whiskey. So the question is, how do you need to really drink from a cup of 3 ounces? So there is a source. It's a minority opinion. It's the Maharsham, Rabbi Shvadron, who was a great Galicianer Poisek, and he makes the following argument, that when the measurement of 3 ounces was given, a revi'it, that's for a beverage that it is honorable to serve someone in 3 ounces. You know, if you go ahead and serve someone wine in a shot glass, he's not going to be too happy, right? Imagine you walk into a bar and they give you beer in a shot glass of 1 ounce. I mean, that won't exactly be a bar you ever return to. On the other hand, when it comes to whiskey, since an ounce is an honorable amount, it works. And for Shabbos morning, again, Friday night, there's no question that doesn't work. Friday night, it does not work for many reasons. But for Shabbos morning, due to the fact that it's rabbinic, there are those who rely on it. There are those who rely on it, on the 1 ounce. And even my father, and he wouldn't do it as I don't think I ever saw him doing it, but he mentioned to me that there is such an opinion. I think I did it once, make a Shabbos morning Kiddush on 1 ounce. In general, I try to use the 3 ounce glass, and I would not drink obviously 3 ounces of whiskey, but it would be recommended to go with the 3 ounces. One option is if you're together with a brother who could drink 3 ounces of whiskey, that he makes the Kiddush for you and he's mitzi you and he covers you. So that would perhaps be an option to go ahead and deal with this issue regarding Kiddush. For next, I want to continue this discussion a little bit next week with a few other areas of Kiddush. If you do have some good questions, you're more than happy to take them, to address them. And hopefully we're able to learn something. And I do thank everyone for joining us this Thursday night to do a little bit of Limud HaTorah. So it's an opportunity to wish everyone